First, as the war between Hamas and Israel rages on, Russian President Vladimir Putin is in China today, meeting with President Xi Jinping at an international forum. It's Putin's first major international trip since the International Criminal Court indicted him for war crimes in Ukraine.
And just a few hours ago, the Russian president arrived in Beijing to meet with his dear friend Xi Jinping. Officially, Putin is there for the Belt and Road Forum for international cooperation, but the visit is also seen as a showcase of the leaders' no-limits partnership amid rising tensions in the Middle East.
When China's President Xi Jinping welcomed Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Beijing this week, the two leaders hoped to show the world a picture of unshakable unity and strength against their Western adversaries, especially the U.S. They've pledged a no-limits friendship and forged a close trading relationship that's been critical to each of their economies. But Bloomberg's Rebecca Chung-Wilkins reports this partnership between Russia and China is increasingly complicated by Russia's costly war in Ukraine, China's broader global ambitions, and now by the escalating conflict in Israel and Gaza.
This nature of the China-Russia relationship has often been described as sort of the sibling rivalry, but this idea of the older brother and the younger brother. And, you know, when Mao first went to the Soviet Union, it was clear that the USSR was the older brother and China was the younger. That partnership has completely switched. And that really is because of that economic dependency.
I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin test the limits of their limitless friendship. Rebecca, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have been very busy in the past week trying to pull apart the different threads of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And there's a lot to talk about here. I want to dig into all of it. But as with everything these days, it's being overshadowed by what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And that, too, has become part of the China-Russia relationship. Can you just talk a bit about what's at stake for Xi and Putin there?
Well, I think for China, in a way, the role that China can play as a peacemaker and its own desire to sort of be seen as a neutral mediator, as a responsible statesman on the world stage, has really come to define the sort of modern relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping. And we see that again with the Israel-Hamas conflict. And we have seen this chorus of voices from Palestinian envoy to Beijing, from the Israeli envoy to Beijing, from Antony Blinken, all saying that China should step up and do more. And Blinken's sort of specific request here is that China use some of the leverage that it has with Iran to prevent the crisis from escalating. And the sort of worry from the US point of view is that the militant group Hezbollah may also be drawn into this war. And so we see this pressure on China globally to take on a bigger role. There is this question of just how much influence China has really in this part of the world. It has sought to build out its influence in the Middle East and to try and challenge some of the US dominance and the US relationships in the Middle East in recent years. And China did preside over this diplomatic deal to resume ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was a really important deal. But we have seen Xi Jinping trying to take up more of that role. And so that is the sort of question mark when it comes to the Israel-Hamas conflict. The other element here, which I'm sure we'll get into, is whether or not China wants to wade into a geopolitical conflict that is just so complex. Its strategic ties and its partnership with Russia, in a way, comparatively, are much clearer. The Middle East conflict is infinitely more complex.
And for Vladimir Putin, the calculation is somewhat different, I imagine. You write that in one way, this benefits Putin because the world's attention is now drawn away from his war in Ukraine and toward the Middle East once again, and questions about where Western aid, military and humanitarian, will go.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of big points. The first is, as you mentioned, the Israel-Hamas conflict as a distraction away from what he is trying to engineer in Ukraine. And I'm sure the Ukrainian leader Zelensky is concerned that the world sort of spotlight has shifted away from the very real conflict that he is engaging in. The other element here, I think, is this sort of increasing concern over geopolitical tensions, over commodities, and over disruption to markets and so on as well, which in some ways sort of highlights the vulnerability of many Western nations, really after having sort of turned away from relying on Russia and turning to other sources, now finding themselves in another sort of geopolitically precarious situation. And there is this element too of what it means to be in, this sort of so-called alternative world order, what it means to be part of the shifting balance of power away from US-led and US-dominated forums and groupings that Russia, of course, is a really important player in.
And Rebecca, this idea of an alternative world order that Russia, China, other nations in their orbit will form this alternative to the West's economic and political dominance really is at the heart of what we're talking about. And at the heart of this meeting that Xi and Putin had, what exactly did they want to accomplish at this meeting?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. That is at the heart of really where China and Russia see themselves as most aligned in the modern era. That is challenging the dominance of the US. And this perception that the US and US-led forums like NATO, for example, are increasingly encroaching and increasingly posing a risk. And it is worth saying that while President Xi Jinping and some in Beijing may not be fully behind what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and there are very serious reservations that, many in China have over the seizure of sovereign territory and so on. But the reasons for Russia, the reasons that Russia has put forward are certainly reasons that China feels sympathy for because of this long history and long distrust of NATO, for example. And of course, there's always this outstanding issue of Taiwan too, which China views as a renegade province. Now, in any potential invasion scenario were China to seize Taiwan by force, no matter how unlikely that is, Russia would be a lifeline. They would be providing supplies, military supplies, food, and possibly diplomatic support too. But there's also a cost, because the more that people talk about the war in Ukraine, the more heightened these concerns are over a potential conflict scenario in Taiwan, which frankly, I think before the invasion of Ukraine, it was hard for anyone really to believe that something so unlikely could happen. But that reality is now starting to be discussed in capitals everywhere, Beijing, Brussels, London. That worry is heightened. And that for Beijing is also a risk.
So the relationship between Russia and China has become even more complex than it was before. And a lot of it has to do with their economic positions. What does Putin want from Xi now? What does Russia need from China?
Well, Russia has become increasingly dependent on China economically through the last 20 months. The last time that Putin was in Beijing, it was around the time of the Olympics, and he walked away with that sort of so-called no limits friendship. Less than a month later, he invaded Ukraine. And so in the last 20 months, the dynamics of the relationship have really shifted. As Russia has become more isolated on the world stage, it's increasingly relied on China. So we see things like, for example, Chinese trade to Russia jumping more than 50% so far through this year. We see the sort of rise of the use of the yuan in international payments. We see increasing exports of goods like mobile phones, cars, and so on to make up for that shortfall as Western firms flee Russia.
Russia is now the biggest buyer of Chinese cars. Imports have jumped fivefold as foreign automakers exit the Russian market. And cars are just part of the picture. There's oil, gas, electronics, clothing, and plenty more besides.
So economically, that question of dependency, that's really the new dynamic that has emerged. And it is firmly establishing, I think, Russia as a sort of junior partner in that relationship. And this nature of the China-Russia relationship has often been described as sort of the sibling rivalry, but this idea of the older brother and the younger brother. And, when Mao first went to the Soviet Union, it was clear that the USSR was the older brother and China was the younger. That partnership has completely switched. And that really is because of that economic dependency. As I say, China really is jumping in to make up all these gaps that Russia is now finding itself as a result of sanctions and also as a result of Western firms fleeing. So the question of cars is a really good example. We have seen this sort of huge jump in shipment of made in China vehicles, car parks, accessories, jumped to about 14 billion in the first 8 months of this year. And it's because of things like, for example, only 8 of Russia's 14 passenger car plants in Russia are functioning at the moment. So it really is relying on China to funnel these types of goods to sort of keep society just up and running. That's sort of the economic element. The other element, I think, is sort of the diplomatic element. Putin wants to counter this impression that he is increasingly isolated on the world stage. He has barely left Russia since the invasion, mainly going to a handful of former Soviet states for these short visits. And that sort of isolation has increased since The Hague issued a warrant for his arrest for alleged war crimes. And so the forums like the Belt and Road Initiative are really these opportunities for Putin to go and stand on the world stage with countries that are perhaps more sympathetic to this idea of an alternative world order. It is worth saying that the fact that Putin is there standing on the world stage is also likely a reason that we have seen fewer foreign leaders wanting to go and in attendance at that Belt and Road Forum. There is just the frank reality that there will, of course, be leaders who do not want to get on stage with Vladimir Putin at a moment like this.
After the break, what does China get from its alliance with Russia? Turning the camera now to the other side, to China and Xi Jinping. China also has a lot that it wants from the younger brother, from Russia.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Russia is really China's major partner in this ambition to build a new world order. Russia is a sort of critical partner in that agenda. And Russia has been important in sort of establishing some of these China-led alternatives to sort of G20 and G7 and so on. And so that question of the diplomatic support is certainly important. And then there is this sort of curious element of the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin, sometimes described as something of a bromance, even though they actually communicate through a translator, which is interesting. They don't share a common language, but they have these sort of commonalities. So they both had fathers who were involved in the Second World War and fought in the Second World War. They're both leaders that are really interested in this idea of the national rejuvenation of their countries. And they're also of a very similar age. They've even sort of celebrated their various birthdays. I think Putin, for Xi Jinping's birthday in 2019, gave him a box of ice cream popsicles, for example. So there is this sort of personal element to the relationship that in some ways has stabilized what has been actually quite a fraught relationship historically between China and Russia.
Rebecca, you talked about some of the things that Russia needs from China economically, and China too benefits economically from Russia.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And one of the key ways really has been as a buyer of discounted commodities. China has become the biggest buyer of Russia's fossil fuels, and coal imports, for example, from Russia to China have more than doubled since 2020. And so Russia is certainly helping China fill that need for more and also for diversified energy sources. It is worth saying China is still embracing that policy of diversification. And it isn't necessarily giving Russia everything it wants. It's still holding out, for example, over Power of Siberia 2, which is this potential new massive gas pipeline. Now, there's an interesting difference here in how Moscow and Beijing talk about this. Often Moscow talks about this imminent deal that is about to be proposed, whereas Beijing is often much more reticent. It hasn't really said much, and there is no official contract so far.
And just as Russia's economy is suffering from sanctions and other fallout from the invasion of Ukraine, China's economy, too, has been going through a very difficult patch, and Russia is helping to fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah, it's worth noting that Chinese exports to Russia have been a rare bright spot. So while overall outbound shipments from China are still sort of falling, the shipments from China into Russia have jumped more than 50%, as I mentioned, so far this year. So it is providing a little bit of reprieve. Still, it's a very asymmetric relationship. So China makes up about a fifth of Russian trade, whereas Russia makes up about 2 to 3% of trade for China. So there is still that very obvious imbalance in the relationship.
Rebecca, earlier you talked about this unlimited friendship that the two leaders pledged to each other, but we see limits of all kinds, and one of them is over China's unwillingness to fully back Russia in its war against Ukraine.
Yes, I think that's right. The last 20 months, if anything, have showed that there are indeed limits to China's relationship with Russia. And it's interesting, we spoke with one former Chinese diplomat, a very influential academic in China, Wang Yiwei, who pointed to these red lines in the relationship. And one of those is this issue of nuclear weapons. And China has been explicit to say, and to sort of almost preemptively say, that it condemns the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict, and that it condemns the attack of civilians as well. So it has sort of highlighted these areas where clearly it would be uncomfortable. The interesting thing that Wang Yiwei pointed to when he gave me that example was that China, he said, itself has faced nuclear blackmail at the hands of Russia. And he was talking about this border conflict back in 1969, where China felt under threat that the USSR might use nuclear weapons as they had this dispute over parts of their shared border. And it does speak to this more fraught or more complex history. There is still some distrust of Russia in circles in Beijing. There is not a full throttle support for Russia. And even for those who do support Russia, Wang says, he says it's really more about supporting Russia's push against Western hegemony, its sort of resistance to the US and to the West, rather than any notion of supporting Russia's incursion into sovereign territory. That for China is a very uncomfortable sticking point.
And another thing you write about that further complicates this relationship is that while the U.S. and Russia really have no relationship now, China and the U.S. are still very big trading partners, and there is a desire to reach some sort of working agreement between the two nations. In fact, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden are expected to meet in November.
Yes, indeed. All signs are pointing to the fact that we are expecting to see this sit down between Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden. And it does look like China is quite motivated to stabilize ties. I don't think there are expectations of any sort of concrete or major breakthroughs, but it's significant that they are sitting down. And part of that need for Beijing's point of view is to sort of show that it's still willing to work with the international world, that it's open for business, for foreign businesses too. And it hasn't sort of become this hostile strategic competitor that it believes the West tries to paint it as. It is worth also mentioning here that as we see China trying to improve ties with the US, this is one of those dynamics that historically has made Russia uncomfortable. And in fact, it was the pressure that Beijing felt from Russia over that border conflict and over other issues that really compelled China to resume diplomatic ties with the US back in the 70s. So this dynamic with the US hanging over this partnership between China and Russia, and this worry by both parties that either Russia or China would side with the US and leave a third party out in the cold, is a sort of prevailing dynamic in the relationship. It's really important to remember.
When we come back, Will Xi Jinping's rise as a global power broker leave an isolated Vladimir Putin behind? Rebecca, we started this conversation talking about how China and Russia are looking to form an alternative economic and political competitor to the West. Do you think moving forward that becomes more durable, that does happen?
I think that China has had some successes in pushing that agenda, and particularly with the so-called global south, with developing nations, and in fact with certain countries in the Middle East too. And although, for example, if you look at that 12-point position paper that China put forward for a ceasefire in Ukraine, that was met with some level of skepticism in Europe and in the US. But it did have some credibility among emerging nations, including countries like Brazil, for example. And so it is important that although there is some skepticism of China's neutrality, and certainly the criticism of its peace proposal has been that it very much favors Moscow, there aren't those same criticisms everywhere. And when we look at, for example, something like the Belt and Road Initiative, even as there has been a recalibration of how that financial lending has been extended, and there is a pullback in the amount of activity that we're seeing, quite a significant pullback, in fact, China has still built successfully this diplomatic clout and these diplomatic ties with countries who are themselves much more skeptical about the US and the motivations of the US in their various parts of the world.
Rebecca, as you continue to report on this, what are you looking for as a sign of a further strengthening of the relationship between China and Russia, or perhaps signs of cracks in the friendship?
The element to watch, and particularly for Xi Jinping, is just how long this conflict goes on for. Because the longer it runs, the more delicate the position for Xi.
Although Xi has failed to condemn the war explicitly, he has also said he supports Ukraine's sovereignty.
It's pretty clear that the war as it unfolded is not something that President Xi or the Chinese would have chosen. China remains very interlinked with the global economy, and this war was mainly a problem for them.
The worry, I think, for China is that if this perceived coziness between Putin and Xi prevails, and the assumption is that it will prevail for as long as this invasion continues, there is this closer perception that China equals to Russia and Russia equals to China. And that is really a position that Beijing does not want. Beijing does not want to be perceived as economically or diplomatically isolated or willing to put itself in that position of isolation. And the other issue here for China is Taiwan. Seeing that invasion of Ukraine has really alerted nations, particularly China's Asian neighbors, to the risks of a Taiwan invasion. That's coupled with rising concerns over potential invasion of Taiwan by China and China's refusal to rule out taking the democratically run island by force has heightened those fears in the US in particular. Now, just to say, it's a highly unlikely scenario, but the fact is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has meant that everyone is talking about this. It's precisely the situation that China doesn't want. And that, I think, is sort of the prevailing worry, the longer term worry for policymakers in China.
Rebecca, always great talking with you.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. This episode was produced by Sam Gabauer and Zenab Siddiqui. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back on Monday with another Big Take. Have a great weekend.